The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Deep right, we got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on deep right. I'm being out right on the target right now. I've got a couple right in front of me. I'm going after it. Right, I got him.
Welcome back to the Lead Pursuit podcast. Tonight we're talking history again, and I'm joined by Mike Peters, co-author of the book Bomb Group, which chronicles the 381st Bomb Group's World War II service, flying from Ridgewell Air Base in the UK. Welcome to the Lead Pursuit podcast, Mike.
Hi, Doug. It's good to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking about the 381st and the mighty 8th in World War II.
Absolutely. Well, we're also joined by a limited crew from the Lead Pursuit. Steve, you're our only guy that decided to jump onto the podcast tonight. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm pretty sure I got voted on because I am the resident non-expert about history. So this was the ploy to get me schooled up a little bit, right?
Exactly. This was my attempt to educate you by forcing you to read. But we talked a little bit before the podcast started. The good thing about Bomb Group is it does not read like a dusty history book. It is not facts and figures. Sure, there's some numbers in there, but it reads much more with the personal accounts and the discussions of everybody as members of the 381st. Now, Mike, when you wrote the book, you obviously had a lot of sources out there. You had official sources, but you really concentrated on a couple voices that kind of carried the book from start to finish. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's really down to my co-author and I, Paul Bingley, and we really think that the word story is involved in history. It's a history. So, and the best way to get those facts across is in a chronological narrative that tells a story. And so many people have written, as you say, quite dry accounts or very highly personalized one-man accounts seen from the cockpit or the turret. And Paul and I, when we met and we started to talk about this book, we've both written different works before. And I'd written 2 books about the Glider Pilot Regiment, and that was done in that sort of format as a story, punctuated by the data and intermissions and all the factual explanation. But really, you want a really digestible thread. And we were blessed when we did Bomb Group with 2 very good accounts written about the 381st. One less known is by James Good Brown, who was the chaplain of the Bomb Group, but it's an absolute tome of work. There's lots of it, and in great detail, and viewed from that unique perspective of, I'd say he's a non-combatant, but he's certainly on our side. You know, he's a chaplain. He's fighting a good fight, and he thinks we're a force for good, and it's a just cause. So, and then John Comer, who wrote Combat Crew, which is what started both Paul and I off on this trail. And if you get a chance and you want to read one personal account about flying in the mighty 8th on a fortress, then John Comer's is, to use that technical phrase, unputdownable. You know, you pick it up and it's like, oh my God, he gets off the truck at Ridgewell and off he goes. You know, and he's an engineer, he's a mid-upper gunner on a B-17, and he's going through that classic, I've got to get through my mission count and get to the end. But the way he observes it and talks about it and the detail he gives about life as a mid-upper turret gunner engineer on a B-17 is really insightful. And if you add that to Good Brown and his accounts of the guys playing baseball, the accidents that happen, the weather, just the frame of mind, the mood, you really sort of feel the mud and the cold of being on Ridgewell in Essex, somewhere in England in the winter, or that feeling of getting back to UK and being able to go to the pub in Cambridge or Ipswich or somewhere like that on a summer's night. You know, or that moment when the guys land and they're parked on the dispersal and they can go to the ops room and debrief and be interrogated, or they can hop over the fence and go to the local pub first before they go back and be debriefed. Yeah, let me think about that when I've just survived the daylight raid over occupied Europe or even Germany. So there's a wealth of material.
The differences in the accounts that as you weave them all together, because you obviously have the fatalistic view of the air crew just trying to make it 25 missions and go through there. But Brown's continual presence in the story from the very beginning to the very end, through all the years there in England, through 4 or more commanding officers and 2+ years, is fascinating because there is a sense of optimism at times. There's also a sense of just crushing fear and defeat and trying to get through all the horrible losses and all the difficult times and the non-combat mishaps and the terrible things that happened there. As we talk about the people that were, on mission 24 or had come back for a second tour and were on mission 49 of 50, and how Brown talks about those things. Yet he also talks about how to bring up the morale of the men and how to get the air crews back into the fight, and how to get them motivated to, knowing the odds were stacked against them, but to go back and to give it their utmost and to go fly another mission back in country.
Yeah, he's almost like the pulse of the bomb group, and
absolutely,
there's a few interesting things he does. So when they first start, he notices that the ground crew aren't there to welcome the aircraft back. They're not sweating out the mission like he does and the officers do. So he suggests that the ground crew should be there when the crews come back, and also he's there when wounded and dead are being carried out of the aircraft and looks after all of that and controls that as a real prominent part. He's remarkable, and he's the guys burying guys who do come back in the aircraft dead. He takes them off to Brookwood and Madingley and places like that, and he carries out the services, he buries them. So he's seeing the complete 360 degree of what he even flies on a mission. He persuades the CO to let him fly on a mission, So he does see it all, and he's just got this forensic detail about the humanity of it, about when guys don't come back and there's no one to play in the baseball team because there's a baseball diamond at Ridgewell, And
there has to be. It's an American base. Yeah. How would you have an American base without a baseball diamond?
And if you were to walk there with Paul or I, we'd show you where it is. You can still make out where it was. So
that's fascinating.
And Good Brown's building, his chapel, which is also the cinema, it's like that scene out of 12 O'Clock High where the guy goes back to the deserted airfield at the start. It's there. The concrete's all there. Good Brown's office is there. The holes in the wall where the cinema projector used to point through, you can still see it. And Ridgewell is not unique like that, but the museum there is fantastic, and we often get relatives of the veterans who come back, and we host them there, and we walk the airfield, and it is like 12 O'Clock High. You can feel it, and sometimes you can stand there, you can think, I can imagine those engines starting up and the aircraft taxiing out, ready to go, or the crew chiefs swarming over them to get the aircraft ready to go, the fuel, the bombs, the guns, all that being done, the servicing of the engines. You can smell it. It's amazing.
I think that's one of the things that Americans have such a hard time just imagining is the sheer volume of aircraft and people and effort that went into that phase of the war. And I know you allude to it, talking about just the hundreds of air bases that had to be stood up and the thousands of dispersals and everything that were built, and just concrete pad after Nissen hut after other building just being put up to house all of these air crew and all the bomber, fighter, and interceptor crews.
Yeah, I mean, we say in the book, it's 33% of UK industrial output, construction output during the war is airfields right to the end. And when you think of all the cities that are being bombed, and the docks that need repairing, and factories that are being bombed at the start, they start building these airfields in 1937 as part of the rearmament program. We know war's coming. And and Ridgewell is one of the better ones that the 381st gets because it's concrete and it's got proper buildings. It's not a grass strip. It's a proper bomber field, and so Ridgewell is one of those pre-war airfields. So if you're in the 381st, you're lucky in that respect. There are concrete taxiways and runways. But you mentioned earlier, Doug, about the size of this project. If you're in Ridgewell before the war, the local village of Yeldham, a few hundred people. A Type A station, 2,000 to 3,000 people. In a matter of weeks, they arrive, from another country. And we tend to think about the aircraft taxiing, the going on the raid, sweating out and coming back. But if you talk to the old boys live around the area of these airfields, they'll tell you about being a young child watching this war go on. And there wasn't time to build fences around these airfields. So they often talk, one of the guys told me about one of the other bases about they'd felled the trees around the perimeter so the aircraft could get in and out taking off on their approaches and landings. So him and his friends used to sit on the tree trunks watching the aircraft go in and out on raids, watch them coming back. And at tea time, dusk time, they'd wander in onto the dispersals, and the kids, they get given chocolate and chewing gum and all that. So there's that interaction, this porous thing about these airfields, and we all think airfield modern, barbed wire fence, perimeter guards. There is none of that. There's none of that. So, and you can see why there's that porous thing that society, they can go to the pubs, they go to the local villages, and imagine being in a local town like nearest town to here, Bury St Edmunds, Ipswich, places like that. Ipswich grew to have 150 pubs because the volume of allied servicemen from all nationalities who wanted a night out, exactly. And it's that impact that happens. And Ridgewell's one of the closest airfields to London. Hence, you get these photographs of Bob Hope, and people like visiting. And it's the showcase. If Ira Eker wants to take, or Doolittle want to take somewhere to visit, Ridgewell's the easiest one to get to, and it's got buildings, so it looks good on film.
Exactly. I kind of laughed as well that shortly after the 381st arrived, the broadcast from Axis Sally welcoming them by name and to their senior officers, and then suddenly there's an OPSEC briefing immediately after that. Yeah. So it's one of those interesting. It's one of those interesting things about being even though it was in an allied country, there were people listening and there were people reporting information, and it's a fascinating, as we talked about numerous times before the podcast, the fascinating special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. and how that's really founded in World War II and moves forward. But it's also a lot of the personal interaction that for years later is really that touchstone between the two countries.
Yeah, I mean, one of the famous photographs is P-47's been unloaded off ships and driven through down the street side on that's in Liverpool. So that where I come from, and the biggest US Air Force base in England was Burton Wood, just outside Liverpool, where all these aircraft came ashore and were assembled, test flown, modified, and then delivered out to their airfields. And that all through the Cold War, that stayed. So there's this American thread around the area all of the time, and certainly here in East Anglia, when Eker decides where he's going to put his bases, he doesn't go further north where he knows Bomber Command are, because the airspace is going to be too busy, especially at night when the Bomber Command's doing his thing. But I touched on it earlier, as you know, an airfield has a heartbeat of its own. It's not just the missions. You've got to do ground runs, air tests. You've got to do fuel convoys coming in, maps being delivered, intelligence. There's just people being posted in, posted out, ambulances coming in. Imagine that impact of an airfield of that size on a small rural village that didn't see anybody normally before the war, and
exactly.
The noise, and the drama, of one of a ground explosion or an air crash or all of that happening around you. So they become the fabric of the airbase, and the airbase becomes the fabric of the village.
Right. It's fascinating.
I mean, there's a pub near me called The Dog, and there's no airfield there at the start of the war. And the US Army engineers arrive overnight because the surveys are done at night. How do you do that? I don't know. But they arrive and they're going to start work the next day, and they all pile into the pub and they literally drink it dry. And it's in Masters of the Air. He talks about this pub, The Dog, at Grunsborough, where they come in, drink all the beer, and in the morning they start building the airfield. The Americans have arrived. They've emptied the pub. Yeah.
Awesome. But I think it's a fascinating perspective that most Americans, when we see the movies that we've grown up on, things like Memphis Belle, we think, oh, whatever. A bunch of airplanes just showed up to England. They started flying missions. Sure, it's flying off of a grass airstrip or a concrete paved field, and they forget the level of logistics that had to go for even a year to get these places ready and surveyed and paved. And I think one of the interesting statistics from the beginning, and you'll remember it better than I was, it was the British contractors were turning over an airbase every 3 days, every 4 days, something like that. Amazing when you think about it, to make all the airfields for these operations.
Yeah, and it's 33% of British building output in World War II is done on airfields, and that at the same time as the cities are being bombed, and we're not. So that all that effort is going onto the airfields rather than rebuilding houses for people to live in.
Oh yeah,
because that's the effort.
Exactly. It's an understanding of the long-term logistics of the war, and that unfortunately civilian populations' comfort and, livelihood was not where it was. It was a pure
No, and Ridgewell's a great.
outbuild.
Ridgewell's a great example because Ridgewell's is the foundations of Ridgewell is the rubble from London driven out from the blitzed houses to build the foundations for the houses and the runway.
Interesting. That's one of those British utilitarianisms that I will call out. That it's when you look at places like Ridgewell and the scale of the building and how it continued to go as more bomb groups were brought in, more diverse kinds of bombers were brought in, and they kept having to expand the mats and expand the parking areas. It's this never-ending logistics cycle that I think, at least for a lot of modern readers or people trying to fathom the construct, the scale for World War II, we just can't, because our only frame of reference is things like the Persian Gulf War, where sure, you unloaded a bunch of stuff from ships, but they really weren't building bases from scratch. You were augmenting things that were already in Saudi Arabia, or any one of the modern military operations where it's been augmenting and building a little bit, but nothing on the scale of building hundreds of airfields all across the UK, and then having to build expeditionary airfields in North Africa, having to get aircraft there, and then all across Europe. Well, good. So one of the questions I've wanted to ask, reading through the book, there is one continuous voice that comes through all through the ostensibly, I guess, a little over 2 years of the story. So tell me how and why the chaplain is the man of the hour.
Well, you're talking about Chaplain James Good Brown, who writes this tome of a book about everything he sees and hears while he's a chaplain. And anyone who's done military service will remember the chaplain, because there are no atheists on the battlefield, is that old saying. But
exactly.
But also, a chaplain has a license to roam. Nobody stops a chaplain going anywhere really, and they wander around, or they deploy in most operations. And Good Brown's a great example. He even flies on a mission.
Right.
And he's an extraordinary character, and he's with the bomb group right from its formation in the States, all through training, and it comes out. And I've walked on the battlefield with Paul and on the airfield, and it's rather like the scene out of 12 O'Clock Highway. He goes to the disused airfield at the start. You wander in there, Chaplain Good's office, the old cinema, is still there, overgrown, and you can get in there and have a look and see where he was. And he's the conscience of a bomb group. I certainly remember my own time in the military as when I was the regimental sergeant major. There was only 2 or 3 people who could go in the commanding officer's office and shut the door and say, "Hey, I'm going to tell you something." And one of those is the chaplain.
Exactly.
So he could do that, but he has this appetite, or this he's driven to record everything he sees and hears, good and bad. And he talks about he captures the attrition and the tragedy of being in a bomb group and people not making the mission count, or just about to make the mission count, or the guys who die on their very first mission.
Right.
There's some great bits in his account where he talks about one of the ground crew comes in complaining about how tough it is living on the airfield. He doesn't fly on the missions, and he's missing his wife, and this is really tough, and war's hell, and Good Brown just gives him a real roasting and sends him back to work. Says there's a war on, man. But he, rather like a tank regiment chaplain, when those bombers come back with dead bodies in, with wounded guys, he's into that wrecked fortress to get the body out and get the guy and get him. And he's the guy who goes with the bodies to the UK military cemeteries and buries them. And
that was part of the fascinating piece, was for someone who you would think that after 2 years of rotating 4 squadron commanders and countless, replacements through, that he would be so negative and so down in the dumps. And at least your words or his words to you, or in your book, you can tell it wears on him, but at the same time, you also get the sense that he understands his duty, and that he understands he's there to really continue to keep the morale up and to keep people focused on being able to do their job. But you're right. He towards the end of the book, where there's the mishap on the Isle of Man, there's it's very obvious in his words that they They really felt like they were done. They felt like the war was over, and to have this bookend tragedy, much like at the beginning, it wore very heavily on all of them to have to go through that.
Yeah, because they kind of expect that there is a risk of being wounded or killed on a mission. But you just touched on the Caroline incident where the bomber explodes on the ground. 23 people killed, including one Brit civilian who just happens to be cycling past.
Right.
It's the biggest ground incident in the war for the 8th Air Force. And it's all about the fusing of the bombs and something going wrong. And the ground crew were, as you can imagine, swarming all over the aircraft to get them ready to fly and armed and fueled and all that. And it goes wrong. There's a massive explosion and all those people's bodies are scattered all over the airfield. And he's there as the chaplain. And everyone looks to him at that point. And he's got this strength to do what he does. And if you pick up his account and you pick up John Comer's combat crew, who writes it from the mid-upper turret's perspective, you get a really good snapshot from two different perspectives of what's going on in a bomb group somewhere in England at the peak of the bombing offensive.
Well, I think that's also the piece that a lot of Americans forget is that, as we talked about, Memphis Belle is kind of a bookend previously, and then everything we see for the Pacific Theater, Enola Gay, things like that, are the bookend on the opposite end. And there's this entire phase in both theaters of heavy bomber action that is full of mishaps, full of shoot downs, full of just things gone awry, flying into terrain, things like that. And that's the difficulty, I think, for a lot of Americans to grasp is the sheer turnover of those crews. And that if you made it to 25 missions, you did rotate home. But at the end of the book, you sit there and you talk about the navigators even doing some of the statistics, and that 10% of their people rotated home. Yeah. The rest of them didn't. So it's an interesting thought about just the level of effort put in by the bomber crews of all the nations that were flying for that time period, for all the heavy bomber action. And that there's a sense of it's pure just fatalism that your number is going to be up, whether it's you don't want it to be a something where it's a mishap. You don't want it to be controlled flight into terrain, but everybody knows that the odds are there that they're just not going to make it back. But at the same time, what was interesting, and Chaplain Brown brought a lot of it back, that it was interesting how a little bit of R&R, a little bit of a break, that could bring back these crews that knew they still probably were not going to finish out the war, but it would bring back their attitude, and it would bring them back to be able to just take a little bit of a break, not fly, and come back and still perform their jobs.
Yeah, and that thing about being so far from home, and then said, "Hey guys, you've got 4 days in London. Go and do whatever you want to do." Or even just to go to the local pub, and that the impact of that on the local society. I mean, where I live, I live in East Anglia, in the middle of all these bases. I can literally look out my back garden to see one and drive. I used to work on the next one, and they're all around me. They're everywhere. And you read about the local towns, and there's the social aspect of it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, Ipswich near me, the US military police imposed segregation on the nights out there. Certain nights of the week were black only, certain nights were white only, and the Brits didn't like this, and there's all that friction, and there's all kinds of other things that go on. But the impact of these guys on British society is huge, and vice versa. And I think that goes back to
I think it's just an interesting point to weigh in on. Is it goes back to, why are two British guys writing about American squadrons? But it's because there's such a historical impact there, and it's a weird dynamic, because you try to talk about it in the modern era without sounding like you're too biased. But it is the common peoples of the English Empire, what's left of the English Empire, banding together to fight against the Nazi German threat.
Yeah, I mean, the whole special relationship is another discussion completely. But at the time when the first American aircraft arrived, and there's already been Lend-Lease and all those things before, but it's like, hey, we're not on our own, and Churchill knew that from the First War. As soon as the industrial might and the sheer economic power of the US is in, that's it. It's game over. We're going to win anyway eventually.
It is. Sadly, it's an attrition game at that point. It's you're not going to win Germany.
And Hitler's told before the war, if he hasn't won by 1941, he cannot win. He hasn't got enough steel or coal and all the rest of it. And and if he fights on two fronts, he's lost. But also the real game changer, if the United States enters the war, that's it.
Right.
You got,
there's always the fascinating discussion of, why did Hitler declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor? There was no need to. Why? But that's
because he's barking mad.
Exactly. That's a whole other historical discussion. But you allude to it as the special relationship. It's fascinating, and I think for people who haven't served in the modern U.S. or British militaries, I think a lot of people don't understand how that relationship still exists and exists for right or for wrong, for richer or for poorer. We end up a lot of places together, and it is directly a relationship forged in the Second World War. And I know my experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in Afghanistan, working with the UK units there in Helmand, it was interesting those units and how they spoke of working with the Americans in their history, and that the very tight ties that we had, even to some of our air counterparts, because we flew with a lot of the GR7, GR9 Harrier squadrons, and so there was a long history there with 4AC and some of the others that had been cooperation over all the years. But it's that current special relationship is founded in World War II, and it's an interesting level of I guess I would say open kimono between two countries that don't necessarily have to work together, are thrust by history into working together, and suddenly realizing that while there are UK interests and there are US interests, and they may not both align, winning the war is in both their interests and not letting the Germans dominate Europe.
Yes, definition of the word allies is quite interesting. It's a common thing. You're not signed up to do exactly the same thing. You've got to agree that. And the bombing offensive is a microcosm of that. It
absolutely is.
And what I do find interesting at the start of the book and at the start of the whole formation of the US 8th is Ira Eaker talks about, he's an Anglophile, and he talks about the Brits have given us everything we've asked: secret technology, airfields, radar, expertise, everything we've asked, they've given it to us. Of course we would, because we need the 8th in the war, and but and a lot of the crews talk about, before the P-51 and the P-47, just getting back to northern France and just seeing the Spitfires coming in to cover their retreat back to the UK, and then seeing English shores. And I mean, as I say, just up the road from me, there are memorials all around the place to aircraft that crashed around the airfields around here. And Mendlesham, near where I live, is there's American aircraft that are in the circuit on finals to land here, and they've been tagged all the way back from Germany by German long-range fighters and are shot down in the circuit.
Wow!
And at that point in B-17, the guy gets out the ball turret. The gunners all move to the forward end of the aircraft to the radio compartment. The guns aren't manned, and these German intruders have tracked the formation all the way back and shoot you down in the circuit.
That's not. They should figure the gears down, the flaps are down. We're good at this point.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very different historical perspective than we've grown up in the U.S. because, of course, we're steeped in Civil War history. If you're in Texas, it's Texas independence history, Mexican-American War, all those kind of things. We are not. Unless maybe you live in Hawaii or Alaska, do you get much World War II battlefield history that you even see? I do know that it's always been fascinating for me. We were talking earlier about flying into Hickam Air Force Base, and you go out to the headquarters buildings, and it still has bullet holes in the concrete and fragments from the bombs.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see the effects of war, and it's hard, I think, for Americans to understand growing up with memorials on the roadside as you're going to the market for actions, 50 plus 60 years ago. And growing up knowing that it was not just your country's military there, but it was an ally that was, throwing its full weight into, keeping Nazi Germany in check.
Yeah, I mean, that you're right. And you can walk around Liverpool, Berlin, London and see blast marks all over the buildings. The airfield I used to work up the hill was where Olds flew from. P-51s, and the headquarters building I used to work in. The big pictures of it with the Stars and Stripes flying overhead, Jeeps parked outside, and it was an American fighter group there. Glenn Miller played there, So you spoke earlier. Why are two British historians, Paul and I, writing this history? And it's a tribute, and it's respect for those men and women who came over here, and fought for freedom and all these great lofty ambitions. But for the UK, it shortened the war for us. It stopped our cities being bombed. And we couldn't have done that without the American effort. It would have taken a lot longer for us to do that. And for those guys to come so far, risk so much, and pay the ultimate price, it's quite emotional for us as Brits. And you can. I've taken a lot of in my post-military career as a battlefield guide. I've taken a lot of Americans around these airfields and around Europe and taken them to Normandy and places like that. And I get it. It's hugely emotional, to them, or to say, take them to the local. So your grandfather drank in this pub in between missions, or this is where they went out, and this is the airfield, or even this is the target he bombed. Here we are, or this is where he shot down. It's a massive part of history, and it is tangible if you're here.
Right.
Quite difficult, as you say, unless you're in Hawaii where it was Pearl Harbor, you've not got that touchstone to feel it.
Yeah, not at all. And I think, as Steve's heard me say, Americans don't travel enough to begin with. So the odds of them going and visiting European battlefields or even airfields and things in the UK is already slim. So it's one of those things that you realize the average American won't have an appreciation for the effort, for the sacrifice, for the camaraderie. And I think that's the thing that, especially for those of us coming from a military background, realizing that you really didn't care, early years, you didn't care who was flying that Spitfire. It might have been a Canadian, could have been a British guy, could have been an American sneaking over there to fly for their RAF. You didn't really care, but it was that there was an Allied aircraft coming back to escort you home.
I mean, Eagle Squadron's another great story, about all that, and what they end up all in the fighter groups. Or most of them go back to the U.S. Army Air Forces, but it really is interwoven into our society and our history. And I do think in the US we talk about the greatest generation, but they're dying out. And it's going to be the celluloid. You mentioned Memphis Belle a few times, and before that it was 12 O'Clock High, which is an all-time classic. And
it is. Rarely
people watch these days. Say, have you seen that? And they go, "What's that?" "Oh, it's in monochrome. I can't possibly watch that."
Yeah, exactly. Why would I watch a black and white movie? Netflix doesn't have anything in black and white.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that Masters of the Air does what Band of Brothers and Pacific did to this, and triggers interest in a younger generation who will get over here before that whole generation is gone.
Right. I think, I always have hope that it will. At the same time, I also know Americans that we are terrible historians in a lot of ways, just because we are separated by these oceans, and so we tend to feel very insulated and very insular from the history of the rest of the world. But when we do travel and we do see the things that Allied service members have done or the places they've been, it's super sobering. I tell people that the most sobering, while at the same time kind of funny, memorial is in the middle of Penang, Malaysia, where I go for work a lot. And it is a tribute to all of the Allied service members, fighting to liberate then British Malaya. But it's a 5-ton or 2.5-ton truck being pushed by a couple Malaysian workers with some British Commonwealth soldiers and I think an American Air Observer or something. And you look at it and you realize it's commemorating an absolutely horrible affair trying to push a truck uphill. But the point is it was all through a unified Allied effort that everything, whether it was the locals, whether it's the Commonwealth soldiers, whether it was the U.S., all pitching in to get that the full wartime effort. And to most Americans, it is purely celluloid. It is purely just what they've seen in the movies.
Yeah. I mean, I regularly go to Madingley, to the US cemetery there. And that's a really sobering place to do. And I take a lot of Brits there to say, you want to see the American sacrifice? Here it is. It's from the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, everybody. They're all in there. And just tell the story well.
Absolutely. Well, let's transition a little bit from the book, because since you are a nerd like us and you are a wargamer, we do have to pin you down on some of that nerddom and how as it relates to aerial and World War II wargaming. Before we started the podcast, you were sharing that you're getting ready to have a little bit of a gaming event there coming up. Tell us a little bit about what's going to go on.
Yeah, I'm very lucky because I live in the country. I've got a large outbuilding, so I've got an 8 foot by 12 foot table, and I can play. I can host some pretty big World War II games and occasional other stuff. But I play 28 mil, 15 millimeter World War II ground games. But there's always an air element. You know, I do like a Typhoon Strike or a. And my favorite thing, because I come from Army Aviation, you've got to have spotter aircraft. So, you know, the Ofsted AOP or a Greek Grasshopper or something like that,
right,
to direct the artillery. So, yeah, it's a group of friends, mainly ex-military who I know and who come over, and we play at each other's houses. And one of the guys has got a Vietnam table. Another guy does medieval War of the Roses stuff. You know, I host the bigger games, so we can do battalion level stuff. And we do play a bit of the board games. You know, I played the PSC Battle of Britain game and a few other things, but I do like to have an air component to it. And I just, even though we're all mainly ex-military, it's just fun and it's good to do. And I enjoy the painting as much as I enjoy the playing and collecting the stuff. So
if I was better at the painting, I would enjoy it. I'm not. I haven't been painting enough lately. I've been spending too much time playing and writing and doing everything else.
And you do drag stuff over. I mean, I find that from your own experience, but also, you know, if you get into an argument about what can a 50 cal do or what can't it do, or, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And we were having a talk about how would we try and play a bomb group game based on the book, you know, and how would you replicate a combat box and the interlocking arcs of fire, and how would a fighter break in and that kind of. So, you know, I'm hunting around what would be the best set of rules to do that and play it, because it's such a fascinating thing, that US doctrine that comes across the Atlantic in 42, and you're like, wow, Norden bomb site, loads of machine guns, just going to punch our way through, you know, and the RAF looking at them, shaking their head, saying, "You don't want to do it like that. You know, you're going to lose loads of guys." No, and it almost stops, doesn't it? They almost think, "Hey, we can't sustain this." Even with our industrial might.
But the true American way of war, we just keep throwing more men and more material. And I say it not as a joke. I'm dead serious. That is the American way of war. And
the Russian way as well.
And the Russian way. And so it's always one of those things where you sit there and you say, if you want to understand, you know, how America won the Second World War, don't look at how the Sherman tank was built, how the B-17 was built. Look at the sheer numbers of them. That's how it was done. It was not necessarily any one technological revolution. It was sheer applied numbers and reliability.
Yeah, people ask me that when I take battlefields tours. Say, you know, what is the thing that? How did the Americans win? I go, the C-47. The Jeep, the production of jerry cans.
Yes,
you know, just the
simple. I bring up the reliability of a Sherman versus a Tiger. If I can drive for 50 miles and not throw a tread, then guess what? I can actually drive to the battle and not be a fixed bunker.
Yeah. So and also, and it comes out in the Air Force side as well, the mechanical awareness of the American population and British population versus the German population. I think it's at the start of the war, less than 10% of Germans can drive.
Right.
Whereas your American farm boy, he comes straight off a tractor and he can service it. And if he can service a tractor, he can service a Sherman.
And it's so true, because you look at how agrarian Germany was, and it's even in Hartmann's all the writings about him. One of the guys that we interviewed who wrote Black Tulip, that everyone is coming from these super agrarian lifestyles. Yeah. Going to glider school to figure out how to fly, and no one is walking in the door with great mechanical knowledge, great aeronautical knowledge, not at all what you're seeing in some of the other countries. And especially, you know, we forget in the US all of the aviation going on in California, and that so much that we relied on in the early war years was because there was already a large aviation industry there. And and
the training as well, because, you know, the RAF and the RCAF, they rely on these American training schools with the good weather and the trainer aircraft and the fuel and all of that. And most of the British fighter crews and bomber crews that train over there say it was great. We flew every day, more out,
Yeah.
and the training output, the number of flying hours that an American pilot has versus a German pilot in 1944 to 45, the Germans have no chance.
Right.
An American fighter pilot has 4 times the flying hours of a German in a better
Might have
aircraft.
made that joke to a fairly royal British guy while we were all training in Arizona, and I looked at him and said, "This all could have been yours, but you raised the price of tea."
Yeah. I know the guy you're talking about. I used to work with him. Yeah.
So y'all would come over and train all the time in Arizona because the weather was great. The conditions were what you needed to fly.
Yeah.
And it was always fascinating for us how much utility our ranges got from non-US.
Non-US use. I mean, are you talking about Watts in Tucson?
So Watts is one of them. The whole El Centro and that.
Yeah. So before El Centro, I used to run it at Watts, and it was never lost on me. I was there in Arizona for 4 months at a time. The weather, the facilities, the whole thing, and our guys would get to do forward air control once a year in UK. And out there, it was all day, every day until it was like, we're tired now. Can you stop sending the A-10s? Okay, we've had enough.
That's a good problem to have.
These guys were all going to Helmand and they're like, we want a British controller. We want a British controller. We want to do it. And it was like, oh God, we're so tired. Give us a break, guys. So many aircraft.
That's a good problem to have. But to go back to World War II, that's the same good thing that we had with American flying locations. And you talk about it obviously with the 381st, even though nobody wanted to fly in Texas in, Rattlesnake Airfield, you have beautiful weather. And other than the sandstorms, you have the ability to really knock out some good training. And that, I think, leads to the entire U.S. Air Force or Army Air Force, and then, the 8th Air Force specifically, being well trained, except for when they transition to Savannah. And you don't cover it in the book, but it's so funny for me, having lived in South Carolina near Savannah and finding out how many weather cancellations they had, because it was crappy East Coast weather. And every time they tried to put up a big practice run, things would cancel because it was rainy, it was overcast. It was great training for England, but not
and interesting. Later on, when you get into the campaign, where some bomb groups have formation aircraft with brightly multicolored aircraft to formate, and the 381st don't, because their formation flying so good. They've concentrated so much on it, they don't do that.
Right.
And there's different methods that different people do at different stages in the war to choreograph those aircraft in UK airspace using the minimum fuel, so they've got enough fuel to get over the target, to loiter, to go around again, to get back. Right. And all of the logistics of that. And going back to the gaming, you touched on the manning resources and all that. I like that in games where national characteristics are built in. Right. Because the British mentality in World War II is shaped by their experience of the Great War in 1418. And it's similar to the Americans in that it's steel, not flesh. Right. We can only sustain this many infantry divisions, this many armor divisions. We need to keep our industrial base intact because we're going to fight alone at the start. And we've taken such great casualties in the Great War. We're not going to do that again. So we're going to use artillery and air and all that. And it's actually, people perceive that to be the American way, but the Brits are even more that way. The Americans say, in the end, the Americans have got a more casualty, willing to accept more casualties than the Brits. Right. And certainly I play Warlord on there, or Two Fat Lardies, ain't half. I'm ain't been shot, mum. And an American section is 11 figures. Right. A British section is 8. And a German section is 8, but 10. The Germans have got a heavy machine gun. The Brits have only got a Bren gun, and the Americans have got more people and a bar, and it's just, and it's just the sheer firepower that this American section has, That was always my introduction to that in playing Squad Leader. That the first time you got truly heavy firepower units was when the Americans show up in GI Anvil of Victory. Other than that, it's been German engineer units were the only ones that had that heavy level of firepower. And then all of a sudden, as an American player, you're running around the board with more firepower than anyone else, and it's and a half track with 3 machine guns on it or whatever. Yeah,
exactly.
But that goes back to the air component. That's why your B-17 is bristling with machine guns. It's like, okay, we're just gonna go.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. And Steve, I know you and I have talked about playing the B-17 in Blood Red Skies. I think that's one of the tough things is bombers in the game are still they're still too vulnerable, heavy bombers, because you just don't get enough of them to have that wall of lead.
Yeah, it's not really, it's not really like Mike was saying. There's no good way to play that in a game. It's kind of like, how do you best represent this interlocking fire and that sheer numbers of what an American bomber group was bringing to the table, right? Unless you're going to put 50 B-17s on a 4x4 table, right? It's how do you balance that in the scope of a game? I've been really enjoying listening to this. Couple notes that were just kicking in my head that always seem to come up on the Ready Room, right? That argument of, this was the best plane or this was the best pilots. And I want to jump in a couple times and say that, what Mike touched on, that old saying that quantity is a quality unto itself, right? Like,
exactly.
Come on, give us some credit for the industrial might there, right? But yeah, how do you do bombers in a game where you're representing one plane for one actual aircraft, right?
I think that's the tough part, is that, like in Blood Red Skies, where normally you'll only see one, maybe two 4-engine bombers on the table, and even using the doctrine card like interlocking fire, you're only changing the odds slightly in the favor of the bombers. It's not. I don't think it's representing well just the sheer number of shots that a whole bomber box would have. But
I think that's a real problem, and I found that with obviously I play tabletop games with the ground element, or even when I play air games, getting that 3-dimensional aspect as well, the different heights and the advantage of height and all that. And I found out with the PSC Battle of Britain game, it's a good game. I enjoy playing it, and they've got the operational level right, the attrition rate, but you haven't got that thing, and they're all about fighters, aren't they? Really, all these games are written from a pilot's perspective about fighters.
Are. That's always been our argument about Blood Red Skies, is attack aircraft were kind of an add-on. They were targets in the first version of the game, and then finally became kind of an add-on where you could do things with them in the airstrike rule book that came out. And they've done a good job integrating them in now, but it's just so funny because even the majority of US players, they might play a dive bomb mission, they might play a heavy bomber mission. They don't play the things that probably you and I would find fascinating, is the Typhoons going out and doing armed reconnaissance, hunter killer kind of missions. But those scenarios are in the rules. Steve, you were laughing at me for suggesting scenario 11. And for Mike, that's one of the scenarios in Blood Red Skies where not only do you have to fight off the opposing side's fighters, you have to go out and search for and find the ground targets, much less even actually bomb them. So while you're bombing ground targets, you're getting jumped by enemy fighters. Yeah, exactly. So
see, I want an AOP, so an armed recce aircraft, the old spotter aircraft. I love that because that's my unit history, and you read about these guys. 109s can't shoot them down because they're tight turtles so tight. And they fly into air defense boxes deliberately so the M109s will chase them in there, and they get shot down.
Shot down by the
So I'll tell you, Mike. I heard you mention the grasshopper earlier. I have a couple hours of tail dragger practice in an L4, and if you were crazy enough to fly that into like a World War II combat area, I mean, that's just certifiably insane. I mean, cruising around at 90 knots or whatever, that's just
that's 90 knots of a tailwind, I think.
Yeah, on a good day,
on a good day.
And loiter around. I mean, I do Anzio a lot. I actually go to the battlefield at Anzio, and I've taken aviation and tank units there, and they could fly the Oster AOP so low and so slow, and the ground's so flat in the terrain there that they could almost hover over a tank turret commander on the radio, direct the tank turret to the next target from there, and it's just wow, that's real. Not only is that great flying, it's to be that slow and that static on the battlefield. That's taking a huge risk of being shot down as well. It's phenomenal thing to do in a canvas powered aircraft in World War II.
It's insane. I wish I knew the name of the book off the top of my head. I have a book that was written by some grasshopper pilots. And it's, oh my God, to hear the stuff that they talk about in that, and just, I mean, it's certifiably insane, the guys that did that.
Yeah, I mean,
it's funny to see that, and then coupled with like Okinawa, where with a Marine, VMOs would do the same thing with the grasshopper, and to think about them flying over all that mountainous terrain and getting that low and that slow, and trying to direct both air and ground fire. Yeah.
And the size of shells that are flying around, big coming in from naval gunfire support.
The 16 shells are about the size of their airplane.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. They could actually see them. They're so big. Yeah, it's quite an amazing thing. And I think that's why. I mean, you might convert me to go and have a look at Blood Red Skies, because I've sort of gone away from it thinking there just isn't a game out there that does enough to play. So Seaborn games I used to play in the past, and sort of dabble thinking about going back to doing some torpedo boat stuff, but just for the fun of it all. But the air games, and having been in the air environment myself, it just need that bit more, and fighter games are great, and dogfighting it's good fun, but I just want a bit more.
The funny thing is, I think the reason we like Blood Red Skies is such a quick and easy learn, and it plays fast. So lose a game in 30 minutes and pick up and build another one.
Yeah, that's cool. You can respawn and play again. Yeah, it's
exactly.
Good,
we laugh about that a lot with some of the scenarios, because there's sometimes that you'll lose in 15 minutes or less, and you'll just get absolutely creamed, and that's fine. Set it up, do something different, do a different scenario, and it's
and that's where it's quite clear it is a game, because a lot of the scenarios you think, I just wouldn't do that. I'd turn away. And a fighter pilot wouldn't do that unless they had all the odds on their side, but in a game, same as any war game, you think, for the sake of the game, I'm going to crack on. I'm not going to wait for artillery. I'm not going to wait for infantry. I'll give it a go. Or I've taken 20% casualties, but I'm still going to fight.
Not so much. That's the best yet also most maligned part of Blood Red Skies is the mechanic for, as they call them, boom chits that they track. That it's a mixture of morale, fuel, damage, all those things all rolled into one. And more often than not, you don't shoot down all the enemy airplanes. You, in fact, get them to break and leave the battlefield by just successive, awarding of boom chits to them by shooting at them. Or through their own buffoonery and causing themselves to to
and that's not too far from the truth when you look at Bomb Group and you look at we're just waiting for the early years for the US fighters to turn back. And then there's no fighters, then we'll attack, and there's all those edges where they don't know the P-47s have got the new drop tanks and a bit more fuel, or, Zemka's great at this, he reworks his aircraft because he's been involved with the development of the P-47 right from the start.
Right.
And they fly on for another 15 minutes and the Germans come storming down thinking there'll be no fighters, and Zemka's Wolfpack's waiting for them. I love things like that. And but when they turn away, or, the two-engined, the Ju-88s and the 410s and 210s sit out of range with the rockets and just firing them into formation, and the 50 cals can't reach.
Yeah, it's also like the sad inevitability of the night fighters, that you're just flying along on your night bombing route and minding your own business,
and you're dead.
They roll out of you with the rockets, and so it's an interesting technological and psychological chase, watching the evolution of bomber warfare. That there's the interceptors finally trying to do more standoff attacks, even daytime just deliberate rocket attacks and things like that. But then the cat and mouse of fighters staying longer, fighters flying at different altitudes, fighters intermixed with bombers, everything to surprise the interceptors and to be where they thought they weren't going to be.
And the whole crass mistakes that are made, that RAF Fighter Command could have had the Mustang a lot sooner. I said, no, we don't need fighters to go that far. And the US as well, we don't need a fighter escort because our bombers have got all these guns. We're just going to
got all these guns. We didn't call it the fortress for nothing.
We're too high for flak, and fighters can't get near us, so we don't need fighters. The bomber will always get through. And endurance, the whole thing about defending your homeland and having that loiter time,
Well, we always laughed about it, especially recently, working together to do the Fulcrum Leader series of Cold War games, that you didn't need a lot of fuel in the MiG-21 because you weren't going anywhere. You were fighting over your airfields. You're defending against the American B-52. So, you don't need a great fuel reserve when you're not flying 300 miles inland to strike someone else's
But the world
target.
changes, doesn't it? The English Electric Lightning was the same thing, Mach 2.2 out over the North Sea, and then, I've just got time to fire my missile. Okay, time to go home. I'm out of fuel. No dogfight. And the Tornado, the F3, not designed to dogfight.
I don't know how the F3 guys did it. Just the concept of flying that far north in the middle of nowhere on an intercept mission. Fascinating.
But it's a weapon. It was a missile platform, wasn't it? It wasn't designed to dogfight.
I was about to say exactly. It was not to go out there and find enemy fighters. It was to go out and find some bombers, lob some missiles, and go home. So just fascinating change in aerial warfare.
Used to tease them a lot and say, you're not really fighter pilots, are you? You don't actually fight anyone.
I'm sure they love to hear that.
Guaranteed a rise. Guaranteed a rise.
Well, it was interesting because when I went through my F-18 training, we had one of their backseaters as an exchange officer in our F-18 squadron. So for him, it was a whole new world because the F-18 was designed as a dogfighter.
Yeah.
So he was now flying in the back of two-seat F-18s where he'd been just a pure radar intercept officer and of a missile launching aircraft. Yeah, totally different.
Different world. Yeah,
it was interesting to get his perspective on things. And of course, he used to laugh at us for our 45-minute flights. Like that's not really getting flight time. So that's I think the interesting piece when you look at the evolution of even bomber attacks. And I was going back and reading some Vietnam accounts with B-52s and their first encounters with SAMs and things like that. Is there's always this arrogance on the bomber side that we carry enough, whether it be electronic warfare, guns, armor. We'll always be good. Forgetting that they're also.
Well, you wouldn't go otherwise,
large.
Would you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you told them they didn't have the capability, you wouldn't launch. But yeah, it's so interesting to hear a little bit of that, and it probably is every branch of the military. Tankers are probably the same way. No one's going to shoot us with RPGs and ATGMs. But it's fascinating to see how that very quickly that gets dispelled, and then how does a military force react? What do they do when they get bloodied the first time, and it's suddenly apparent that their tactics, their equipment, their techniques, they're not matching up to what the threat is, and how do they modify and how do they change?
Yeah, and if you look at the Norden bomb site, it was good, but there were better sites out there. Yeah, and that was kept so secret and locked away, and just had the self-destruct button on it and all that kind of stuff, But the whole thing is built around a Norden bomb site and its accuracy, and American bombing doctrine in World War II is precision. We're going to hold the moral high ground. We're not here to bomb cities and do that kind of thing. And Harris is out of necessity is the only way we can hit Germany in 1940 is to bomb big areas, and we're going to do it.
Right. And it's I was just gonna say it's one of those rationalizations where if your technology does not allow you to be precise, you still have to hit the enemy, and you have to do damage to the enemy whatever way you know how. And while it is unfortunate that the British tactic was much more against
blood.
Entire infrastructure. I hate to call it civilian infrastructure because it was wartime, but the entire infrastructure of Germany, it is going to cause more casualties. But let's also, like we said earlier, air quotes about the word precision. When you're bombing a rail yard, you're also leveling all the houses around the rail yard. So it's not precision as we think about it today.
Yeah, there's that well-exposed quote of Bomber Harris when he's pulled over by the speed cop in UK, and he said, "You need to slow down, sir. You're going to kill somebody." And he says, "Young man, I kill thousands of people every night." Is his response. He knows it.
That reality. He does. And and it's a unfortunate state of the war, but I think there's a misunderstanding as to the reasoning. And I think a lot of people don't go back and look at the tactical capabilities or incapabilities of the British Bomber Command at that point versus what the Americans brought. And then the Americans saying, we're not, whether, as you say, it's because of the moral high ground or because they just go, that's not the way we're going to fly because we've put all of our money into this bomb site. So we're going to make sure that this works. I'm not so sure it was moral high ground. I think it was validating the Norden bomb site. Yeah,
but the irony is when they first start, they've only got a dozen B-17Cs at the start, and it's for bombing ships.
Yeah.
And there's that great inter-service wrangling, which you as a Marine, you'll love, between the Navy and the Air Force in the States about who defends the coastline.
Right.
And the B-17 is designed primarily to bomb attacking battleships, and that's what the precision's for.
Yeah, not for hitting a railroad.
And that's how they justify it. And the cost of it is staggering. The cost of the Norden bomb site, and the B-17 itself is so far ahead of everything else in the technology that it embodies.
Right.
But then it just becomes a means to an end, and then they think every P-17 is going to have a Norden bomb site, and that's not the case when they get further down the stream. So we can't afford to do that. We can't make enough. So you've got lead bomb aimers in the bomb group and each squadron saying, when I drop, you all drop. You know, and you've
There's
got Toggle
precision
in
for
the
you.
end who are not even bomb aimers. They're just gunners who've been trained to pull the right switches
Yeah.
to arm the bombs and drop them. Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head when you say that it's as we would call it, a self-licking ice cream cone. You know, it's to
my favorite
justify
saying.
all the effort that you've put into it. We're going to prove that tactic works. And whether we're talking about Norden bomb sites and B-17s, or if we're talking about heavy EW equipped B-52s in Vietnam, where we knew that the jamming was okay, but not necessarily as good as it needed to be. And sure enough, the SA-2 still got through. And then it did nothing against the fighters. So when the fighters would still come up at night, they'd find you. So it's an interesting, use of a technology to the point to validate that worked. But in the process of, quote, validating it, we proved that we didn't, necessarily have as tight a grasp of the technology as we thought.
Definitely. And how do you play that into a game? The whole night fighter thing is interesting. And certainly people say when I talk about my big passion is Allied airborne landings in World War II. And, why did they land at daylight at Arnhem? It's because to fly that close to the German border at night would have been suicide, because the German fighter arm could be suppressed in daylight with 1,000 Allied fighters. But the German night fighters in amongst a transport stream would have been absolute carnage.
Yeah.
Unarmed transports flying around with gliders behind them. If you're the average Ju-88 pilot, you'd have been more than happy, or a 110 pilot to get in amongst that.
Very easy. Yeah. Well, so let's talk briefly about the difference between British and U.S. glider pilots, because you were educating me before the podcast a little bit about that and a little bit about your work on those books.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing if you're a gamer to look at it, because if you're going to do an Allied game, essentially the US US Air Force glider pilot were good pilots. They were trained to fly the Waco, the CG-4, which is aluminum. Aluminum
for all of us on the other side of the
aluminum framed glider, which is a whole. And when it comes down to economy of scale, perhaps we could talk about that in a minute, about how the Americans go for the glider design concept and the training of glider pilots. But the big thing for the Brits is they've watched the Germans in 1940, Eben Amel. Churchill comes away and says, "Hey, I want that. I want 5,000 airborne troops, and I want a glider arm." And 18 months to struggle to get it, and in the end, they build a great glider, the Horsa glider and the Hamilcar glider. But the pilots it's a big wrangle between the Army and the Air Force. Imagine that. And it's the Army says, no, we want our gliders to be flown by soldiers, so that when they get on the battlefield, they'll know where they are and what to do, etc. And this evolves into a total soldier concept, where you're a sergeant or a staff sergeant pilot, very few officers in a squadron. You fly along with 28 guys on the back, or a Jeep and a 6-pounder gun, and you fly into battle. And when you get on the ground, you are capable of fighting as a formed unit. All the pilots gather together and form a battalion, and you're light infantry.
That sounds like a terrible idea the United States Marine Corps would come up with.
No, it's very Marine Corps.
I think it sounds like a great idea, because as a pilot, I cannot get behind the idea of getting in an airplane without a motor on it. So I think it sounds like a great idea.
But they take 90% casualties at Arnhem. Because they're never really supposed to be used. They're a stopgap, but in Arnhem, no one's getting out. So as NCO pilots, they're used to replace all the dead senior NCOs, etc., to fight as individuals on anti-sniping patrols. They're operating anti-tank. If they've flown an anti-tank gun in, they stay with that crew and fight alongside the anti-tank crew. So I did 2 books on it, and it's interesting. If you fast forward across to the States, and it's a bit like the B-17, B-24 program, where it's like, okay, we need, and it's classic American, it's like, okay, we need a glider force. We haven't got one. Okay, we're going to fight the Japanese and we're going to fight the Germans. So we need 10,000 gliders. Okay, let's go and build those. So, the Weaver Aircraft Corporation decide we'll build this glider. And the design of the glider is such that Hap Arnold says, I want a Jeep that can fly. Such American thinking. I want a Jeep that can fly. So the Jeep lands and the wings fall off and it drives away. They can't do that. Even the US can't do that in short notice. So they build a glider that will carry a Jeep or a gun. And it's going to be easy to fly, whereas a Horsa glider's got huge barn door flaps and can land in a very short space on a battlefield. And it's designed around the infantry platoon so that the platoon is the unit of measure that goes in it. So they'll land together. And the American glider is designed around this one jeep and one gun, or one section, or half a platoon. So they're not in the same aircraft. So this is the problem. The gun and the jeep aren't in the same aircraft. The chances of two gliders landing in the same field, particularly in the dark, zero. But the original concept was that the C-47 would pull two at a time in a staggered tow, but that there were never enough C-47s, or the range that shortened the range. So you get this thing of what you end up with is a glider that's very easy to fly with spoilers instead of flaps, and it's easy to land as well. So it's great to land. It's very easy to learn to fly in a short space of time. Thinking about pipeline time and generating all these pilots, and that's good on a nice warm airfield in the States, but not good if you're trying to land on a hot LZ where you're being fired at when you want to get down really fast and it doesn't get down very fast. So there's all kinds of issues around it. It turns out to be a great glider for special forces and small, compact partisan resupply missions in Yugoslavia, which is what the Brits use it for, and things like that. But it's so different. You can put a jeep in it. You hook a cable to the jeep when it's loaded. Once it lands, the pilots jump out, unhook some plugs, and the jeep driver drives out, and the cable pulls open the nose of the aircraft like a space mission, and out you go, and then you unhook it and drive away. But there's thousands of these things. But the big problem is the pilots. And Gavin, I found a letter when I did the Arnhem book, and Gavin wrote a letter after Market Garden saying, all of these pilots you gave me, these Air Force pilots flying gliders, some of them were really helpful. They wanted to fight, but they went off and fought their own war. They didn't fight in a disciplined unit, so they got in the way. Others of them just sat in their blankets and waited to be picked up because that's what they'd been told they had to do. Yep. Others of them went off the track and started looting and doing things. They just didn't have a role. Right. And it's just an interesting, contrasting concept where it's about how quickly can the US grow a capability. Yeah, and you mentioned the Sherman tank earlier. It's the same thing. It's like, okay, it's economy of scale. It's mass. We can do this. There's the pipeline. Just keep churning it out. And you see that.
I think there's a motto almost for the American military is that we'll devise something, then we'll figure out its battlefield role. So we'll buy 10,000 of them, then we'll figure out how we're going to use them.
Well, you've only got to look downstream at the anniversary now of the Ardennes offensive, where the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive, and they've lost the capability. They try and use gliders and paratroops, and their transport crews can't do it anymore. Most of the paratroops have never jumped before. It's a scattered, useless drop. They're dropped in the wrong place in poor weather, and they've lost so many transport aircraft on the Russian front. And the old Ju-52 from War Eagles Dare, what an iconic aircraft, and they haven't got the crews to do it anymore. It's they've lost it.
Well, we had an interesting discussion, me and a couple other guys that were talking about the sad reality of the Ardennes and the Battle of the Bulge was it wouldn't have mattered whether Allied troops were a speed bump there or not. The Germans just could not have exploited success because they just didn't have the men, they didn't have the fuel reserves, the ammunition. It was one of those points where that was their second to the last gasp, and it was still going to all be for naught.
And it's a false lesson because the only reason they got away with it in 1940 was because French air reconnaissance was so bad.
Yeah,
the French knew it was there. They saw them all there in 1940, and they were stacked up, and it was a huge bottleneck. And the French chain of command could not cope with the realization of what they'd found, or flex to use air or artillery to destroy or disrupt that.
Right.
You're talking about a French army in 1940 where the senior commander's headquarters for the whole SACEUR equivalent has one telephone. Because it's vulgar, they don't want a telephone in the headquarters.
We got all that carrier pigeon, messenger bag.
And if you want to do an air game, try doing the British RAF in 1940, trying to bomb the Albert Canal with the Fairey Battle bomber. Yeah. It's a bit like trying to use the Devastator, in the early Pacific War. I
think I actually have 3 unpainted Fairey Battles here somewhere.
Yeah.
I picked
There's a lot of Victoria Crosses won flying those in 1940 because it's suicide. Complete suicide to fly those against anti-aircraft alone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think at one point we're talking about. I know we talked about the Fairey Battle and a couple other ones, and you try to put them into a game that's like Blood Red Skies. It's about fighters, and you're like, how do I even put them in the game? it's not even fair to them, But
it's that variable you were talking about earlier, where why are the fighters there? Would the fighters know they were there? Because there's no radar at that point. It's almost World War I SS. Unless you're in a cap overhead of a bridge or something, why would you? What's the chances of you finding those aircraft?
Yeah, I think there was a point where someone brought up where I think it was a Ferry Fulmar had actually shot down a couple aircraft, and we're like, how did that happen? Did they blunder in front of the Fulmar? What happened?
And some of the first 109 shot down over the channel were shot down by an Avro Anson. Yeah. Which has got one Lewis machine gun at the back and one. It's a navigator training aircraft. Yeah. But the pilot was so good, he turned the circle, and the 109 pilots weren't that experienced, so he shoots them down. It's a gunnery training aircraft. So obviously the instructor was in the turret that day, but it's Well, I think that's why, because it's artificial in the game because you want to play the game,
right?
Unless you're playing a counter game, which you mentioned earlier, where it's like, okay, so you didn't turn up. It's like, I get through, I hit the target, but that's boring, isn't it?
Yeah, that's not near as much fun.
No.
We've even talked about with some of the Blood Red Skies aces, because it really emphasizes high skill pilots at certain phases of the game. We've introduced some that were from reconnaissance aircraft, because you even go back to the Mediterranean theater and you have guys flying Marylands and flying
F5s from Malta.
And how you go, Warby, how did Warby become an ace? How is this possible in a Maryland? But so it's quite fascinating, the different aircraft and the crews that took them to those levels.
I mean, that's a great story, the Malta story. I mean, if you want to do an air battle, Malta, I've done Malta, been to Malta many times and looked at that and the airfields, and that's Battle of Britain on steroids. It's really interesting to do.
Yeah, all of my UK counterparts get so mad because I'm really not a Battle of Britain aficionado, but the Battle of Malta is amazing to me. So I enjoy studying that, and we've gamed that a couple times and played out large Blood Red Skies scenarios with it. And it's
I mean, a great one. I don't know if you do it. I don't know if it's a scenario. Is when the Wasp or the Hornet brings in the resupply of Spitfires and the Germans destroy them all on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
Before they could turn around.
Talk
and
about
refuel.
depressing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You've landed them all. We were talking. One of the guys that didn't make it on tonight, Brett. He and I were going through all the different missions, and you see, okay, now we're up to 30 Spitfires, and now we're down to 5 Spitfires. And now, as soon as you get things, on the island, you either get them shot down or damaged on the ground. And it makes
and how they rectify that. That's inept command. U.S. Navy's risked one of its biggest carriers along the Mediterranean to deliver these aircraft to you, and you just waste them. It's just criminal, absolutely criminal. And Churchill has to go to Roosevelt and said, "Hey, that carrier lent us? Could you just do another run? We'd like
exactly.
It's you can do Faith Open Charity, the Gladiators, and all of that. It's
let's not speak of the Gladiators. I hate biplanes. I think I told someone, I'm like, I will never play those in Blood Red Skies. I refuse to fly a biplane.
Nah, you got a few Henschels and Gladiators and CR-42s.
Exactly.
It's really good to do. I mean, any of those are worth a go. But Malta itself, or a pedestal convoy game, the catapult aircraft, things like that.
Steve, sounds like we need to do that for Adepticon in March. Sounds like we have our marching orders. Go back to Malta again.
Oh man, I mean, we can never have too much Malta, right? There's tons of content there.
Yeah, there is. There's always
for an air game, and you get the Italians in there as well, who are sometimes good, sometimes not. It's often not. You get all that, but nice aircraft, color schemes.
Oh, yeah. Well, awesome. Well, we've been talking for a while, so let's wrap this up. Mike, it's been super enjoyable to talk to you both about wargaming and about Bomb Group, and to talk about just the stories of the crews and how you guys kind of put together the whole narrative and the style of the book. Steve, any questions in closing that you've got for Mike?
Man, I just want to say about this book. So I had the pleasure of going to the 8th Air Force Museum down there in Savannah, and it was awesome to see it. And I get a lot of crap because I don't read a lot of history books and everything. That's because they're usually boring. Okay, that's why I don't read them, because I don't want to read a textbook. This book is just the way it's written and the way it tells the actual stories of what's going on. It really is like you're reading a movie, and to think that these stories are all true and actually researched and such. I mean, it's just a phenomenal book. So if you're looking for just a really entertaining book, I've really enjoyed the parts of it that I've read, and I can't wait to go back and read through this whole thing. I've really, really enjoyed it a lot.
Wow. Well, thanks, Steve. Maybe you could put that on Amazon. That'd be great.
Yeah, and an endorsement from a book for me from the people who listen to this podcast. I mean, if everybody doesn't run out and grab it, I mean, I'm sure most of our listeners don't even think I can read. So the fact that I'm endorsing your book is like huge. Trust me.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, Paul, you've talked to me tonight. Paul Bingley, he deserves a huge amount of credit for that. He's, he lives, sleeps, breathes the 381st, and every time I walk that field with him or we talk about it, we both learn stuff from each other all the time. And that's the joy of it. And that's what wargaming does as well. It provokes you to talk about these things. And it is a way of keeping the whole thing alive, isn't it? It's not just on Netflix or wherever. It's another dimension to it. And, I mean, what I say, I'm not. You made the point. I'm closing now. I know about British Anglo-UK relations. It's every town around here where I live and every village has got a US memorial. Go to Lavenham or places like that. There's an airfield there, an aircraft control tower. Most are museums, some are houses. They've all got, my in Lavenham, there's a memorial to the bomb group. In Bury St Edmunds, where I am, there's Rougham Airfield. They've all got the memorials, and they nestle in on the wall alongside the memorials from Helmand, from our own guys, and World War II and World War I. So it really is an important facet of British heritage, is an appreciation. And it's not just the 8th Air Force, it's the 9th Air Force as well, and all the others. And also, of course, it's not just the P-17. We have to mention the P-24 crews and the P-51 and the P-47s, and nearby here at Watcham, the P-38s, and all the other bits. That it's just a huge. It's still here. You can, if you're an American and you come to UK. I mean, I'm 1 hour from Duxford, from the American 8th Air Force, American Air Force Hall, which has got everything in there from B-52, B-17, all that stuff. And it's such an impressive testimony to the American contribution to, liberating Europe and defending the UK. And this book, you said to me at the start, why have you two Brits written this book? And that's it. That's what it's about. We did our own bit, and we're both immensely proud of Bomber Command and all the controversy around that. I don't care about it. They did what they had to do. I'm a soldier, aviator myself. We really do care, but we never lose sight of the B-17, the Sherman, and all those other things. But the guys and women who came across here and put them into the field and did what they did. So, big thank you to your US listeners for that from UK, and a Merry Christmas.
Absolutely, we really don't want to lose sight of that fact that the US-UK relations and the special relationship there, as much as Steve will tell you inside the online Ready Room group that does Blood Red Skies, the UK and US factions may argue and fight a lot about was the Spitfire better than the P-51 or whatever the argument of the day is. But we can't forget that special relationship that did bring the Allies to victory in World War II. And so thank you for writing the book. Thank you for bringing a lot of that history to light. I really, really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you. And it's the P-51. It's better aircraft, by the way. By a long way.
Thank you. You will now be disowned by everybody who's a British citizen inside the Ready Room.
Somebody over in England. It's official. Thank you.
Yeah, well, a Spitfire's not going to get to Berlin until it's in Germany, is it?
Yeah, pretty much.
P-51's a game changer. Although it's got a British engine and it's a British design, but that's another discussion.
That's why I always go back and say it's a partnership. We would not have done it without the engine, so without the Merlin.
We would have figured it out eventually. Come on.
Yeah.
About 1950, we would have figured it out.
Like you joined the war eventually. I get it. Yeah.
Exactly. It would have been a lot of lack of American ingenuity in beating it with a bigger hammer. But awesome. Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.